Hey there, AP kids. It's time for Unit 1, Part 3 of the AP Euro Review. In this short little video lecture, we'll be looking at the Age of Discovery and Commercial Revolution as we're wrapping up Unit 1 this week. So the Age of Discovery, of course, we date roughly from the 1400s, beginning in the early 1400s when the Portuguese began exploring the coast of Africa, looking for a way east by going south. Of course, later on, it will be Columbus who decides to go west to go east. And that will bring the Spanish to the New World, although Columbus never knows that he's landed in the New World, thinking that he has found the Indies to his dying day. Now, when we look at the Age of Discovery, we should remember that the initial dominant powers during this time period were the Portuguese, who established a maritime empire. And they're in competition with the Spanish, whose own golden age, or siglo de oro, is funded by all that American gold and silver that they're getting from the New World. The Spanish eventually will take over Portugal in 1580, the 1580s, actually, about 1580, actually, bringing an abrupt end to the Portuguese Golden Age as Portugal's empire is merged with the Spanish. But the Spanish, just a few years later, will have their own setback, a defeat by the English in the Spanish Armada, and that'll be the beginning of the long, slow decline of Spanish fortunes. By the 1600s, the Dutch, and then followed very quickly after that by the French and the English, will be rising to power and establishing bases and control over trade routes and colonies overseas as well. The Age of Discovery leads to and happens simultaneously with the Commercial Revolution, which begins with a philosophy of mercantilism, which we'll explore in just a few moments. But we will see some of the elements that later will evolve into what we today would think of as modern capitalism. And in fact, a lot of these ideas of what we today call capitalism are pioneered by the Dutch, who established a successful commercial trading empire in the 1600s. They create the Dutch East India Company, as well as the idea of joint stock, exchanges, and insurance for shipping, and also speculation on futures, which will lead to the tulip mania craze of 1637. So when we look at the Age of Discovery, we can see the Europeans are motivated by a number of things. Principally, they had this desire for Asian goods, which dates back to the Crusades and even before then. Now, that trade had been dominated by the Italian city-states, places like Venice and Genoa. But Venice had suffered serious defeats by the Ottomans, who controlled at least the eastern portion of the Mediterranean until they were defeated in a major sea battle in 1571. But in the 1400s, that meant that either the Venetians or the Ottomans were driving the price up, especially as the Ottomans become more powerful. Poorer countries, such as Portugal, could hardly afford these luxury goods, and so they began looking for various alternatives. One of the things to realize is that the Portuguese pioneered navigational and military technology, and in some cases they adopted Muslim and Chinese ideas. By navigational technology, I mean things like the compass and the lateen sail, and developed the Portuguese fishing boat into the much larger but seaworthy caravel, and then loaded it with cannon. That'd be the military technology part. So there was a desire for gold and spices and luxury goods, and also there was a motive of religion, particularly Catholicism, in which missionaries from the Jesuit and Franciscan order often accompanied the explorers. Eventually, what this means is that economic power in Europe shifts away from Italy, leading to the decline that happens during the Renaissance of the Italian Renaissance, and to the Atlantic states, Spain, Portugal, and then later the French, Dutch, and English. Meanwhile, Central and Eastern Europe, who failed to develop seagoing empires and trade routes, generally remained a source of crops for Western Europe, and actually increased serfdom there as nobles struggled to compete in a money economy. Now, the competition between Spain and Portugal, beginning, of course, with the voyages of Columbus, and then quickly after that, the voyage of Vasco da Gama in 1498, which connected Portugal to India, led to competition between the two. The Pope tried to mitigate this with a treaty in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world half to the Portuguese, half to the Spanish. And as absurd as that seemed, it does partly explain why the Philippines and Brazil are held by, well, the Philippines by the Spanish for a long time and Brazil by the Portuguese, because they're sort of on the line or near the line. They were a little fuzzy about geography in those days. It's a Portuguese sailor named Magellan, but working for the Spanish instead of his native Portugal. Magellan will lead the first voyage around the world. He's killed in the Philippines, but it's completed by his Basque lieutenant, Sebastian del Cano, in 1521. And despite the misgivings of Columbus about where he was, this does give people a better understanding of the true shape of the world. In the Americas, the Spanish and Portuguese established colonies, followed by the Dutch. The Dutch are driven out by the French and the English, and then in the 1700s, the English drive the French mostly out of their North American colonies in Quebec and Louisiana. Spanish colonies, Spanish language, and Catholicism dominated most of Central and Southern America, other than Brazil and a few outposts of other countries in the Caribbean. The Columbian Exchange was also a significant part of this story. It's an exchange of commodities and culture and crops between the Old and New World. And here, you could pause here and really study this chart and see some of the key things. Remember, culture is one of those things of exchange, and people, that you have an intermixing of African, European, and Native American people, as well as disease, which wipes out a substantial number of Americans, and various crops and foods and critters and so on. So what are the effects of the Columbian Exchange and colonialism in general? Well, you end up with a global trading network. This is where globalization begins. If you're against globalization, sorry, too late. This is about a 500-year-old process. Of course, this transmits diseases from the old world to the new world, where the natives had very little immunity. It establishes the plantation system in the American colonies. And it also leads to the expansion of the African trade slave, since these plantations are very labor intensive. And they're called plantations because they really establish the production of a single crop for profit, rather than subsistence agriculture, where people farm what they need to eat and sell a little bit of the excess they happen to get. This is stuff that's purely farmed for profit. Some of it's not even food, such as coffee, tea, and indigo. Lastly, we see the conversion of the Americas to Catholicism. And so we'll see that this plantation system is going to produce vast profits, especially from sugar. And later on, those monies will be invested in the new industrial revolution. And in some sense, the factory system is really pioneered in the open air of the plantation, with repetitive tasks, harsh labor, and dividing work into the simplest pieces, giving each piece of the task to a person to do, rather than a farmer sort of thinking for themselves and running their own entire farm process. This leads, as we said, the global trade routes, and you can see them there on the map, stretching from Europe all the way around the world. It also leads to the expansion of colonization. You can see some of the areas there. Remember, the Russians are walking and sometimes sailing eastwards as well during this time period, colonizing Siberia and reaching Alaska in the 1700s. And by the 1700s, Europeans, the Dutch, and then the English explorer Captain Cook have explored most of the Pacific islands and reached Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. And so what this means is the Europeans become the dominant power by edging out Muslim and Chinese mariners for dominion in the ocean. But of course, this leads to rivalries between the European powers. And eventually we'll see the British would dominate India and the Dutch would control the East Indies. And you also see there the triangle trade, which would be one of the engines of economic growth, but also be the main route for slaves. This trade developing in the Atlantic Ocean. There's a close-up of the triangle trade where you see how manufactured goods go to Africa, African goods sometimes went back to Europe, but mostly slaves to the Americas, where things are produced on plantations, as well as North American goods back to Europe, ergo the term triangle trade. So the philosophy of economics here is mercantilism, which is about government control of economics and colonization. In other words, economics is war. So you did have some private enterprise, but under the direct control of the crown. Corporations generally were given monopolies, whereas in capitalism, you have multiple corporations competing in general. Here, you would have a single corporation given the royal monopoly. The idea is to pile up as much gold and silver, or bullionism, so that this can be in the hands of the king to build his military, to attack their enemies, and take their colonies and get more bullion. In other words, sort of like an economic slash military game of risk. Mercantilism drove European exploration, the desire to control particular trades such as tea, coffee, or sugar, to establish plantations on lucrative territory like Caribbean sugar islands. And this is going to lead to numerous wars, especially in the 15, 16, and 1700s. And by the 1700s, the principal global rivalry is between the British and the French. In the Middle Ages, kings had been very unconcerned about economics other than collecting taxes, but now they dive deep into economic enterprises, establishing, as we said, corporations like the British East India Company in order to maximize profit and being willing to wage war, not for land as in the Middle Ages, but for money. This leads to something called the price revolution, or when I think about it this way, global inflation. Significant rise in cost of goods and services occurs by the 16th century. This is damaging to the Chinese and Turkish economies, as those colonies, or excuse me, those countries did not establish global colonies or participate in global trade as actively as the Europeans. Some European countries missed out on this as well. For example, Poland, which remained poor and agrarian. But the countries that profited, the British, the French, the Spanish, and others, had a much higher standard of living. In fact, we begin to see a few people be slightly growing, not as growing as fast as later on, but somewhat growing middle class begin to live a consumer lifestyle, whereas they are interested in purchasing goods and services that are luxury. In fact, this even spreads to some of the middling and lower middling classes. So we see, for example, the rise of the coffee house in London and Amsterdam and various other urbane port cities, the increasing drinking of tea, and the fact that even middle class people can afford expensive dyes like indigo. See greater variety of diets, and this is all going to help lead to an agricultural revolution and a boom in European population by the 1700s. This is going to affect the European class system. Whereas the Middle Ages, it had been about warriors and farmers, you now have a slow but steady growth in middle class people. These are people who are merchants, or perhaps they're professionals, or perhaps they're managers for merchants, or perhaps they are people who are not noble but acquire some farmland and manage to make a profit from that farmland. And some of them move into the nobility, such as the lowest rank of nobility in England is known as the gentry, who sort of hovered between nobility sometimes and middle class sometimes, but they were landowning people. And they're the type of people represented in the House of Commons. In France, skilled people like Jean Colbert, the finance minister for King Louis XIV, will attain power and even nobility, what are known as nobles of the robe. And the old families, the warrior families, resent this, the nobles of the sword. And in general, you do have a rising, small but rising and influential middle class, some of them entering government service. For instance, the British allowed middle class people with mathematical skill to serve as naval officers. And Cardinal Richelieu and later King Louis XIV famously used middle class intendants as agents of government, accountants, tax collectors, what today we would call bureaucrats. Now, as people began to acquire land and figure out how to squeeze it for profit, one of the things they did was stop renting it to peasants and start managing it from their point of view more scientifically. Let's remember the scientific revolution is happening at the same time. We'll come back to that later. And so they began to say, look, we're not going to rent strips of land hither and thither around the village to various families, we're going to take this land and just grow one thing there. We're going to do 4-field crop rotation. We're going to apply breeding techniques to our sheep and horses and crops. And so this means more hands-on management by the owner, who ceases to rent and now farms it himself using hired labor, which means he needs far less people to work the land. What happens to the renters who are thrown off their land? They tend to weave cloth in their homes, or they become wandering migrant labor, or they migrate to cities. And so this enclosure movement displaces a lot of people who were in the bottom end of the farming class and forces them to either figure something else out or move, and causes a great deal of hardship. As we said, we see pre-capitalist structures appear during this time period. The commercial revolution is underway. And so one of the things is we have an increase in property rights. John Locke writing about the property as a basic human right in the 1680s and 1690s. And so this is especially strong in England, the Netherlands, and some other places, as the safety of your property makes you more likely to invest. And so the law recognizes that investment is good for the country, because if people make money from investment, you can tax them and build your navy and army and so on. And in fact, colonial profits are often reinvested as venture capital in new endeavors, such as Watt's steam engine in the 1700s. And again, we'll obviously be coming back to the Industrial Revolution in a couple of weeks. You see pre-capitalist structures appear. The Dutch and the English, especially the Dutch, pioneer this. We mentioned this before: joint stock companies, the stock exchange. You see there the Dutch stock exchange pictured in a painting. Insuring ships and the whole concept of buying risk, and advanced banking techniques, and even the first national bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, and later on the tremendously influential Bank of England. Now, of course, there are some crises, such as the tulip mania crisis, or the bubbles, the South Sea bubble and the Mississippi bubbles in the early 1700s, where poor investments endanger entire economic structures with collapse. But by and large, this works. Countries that use these methods, such as the Dutch and the English, begin to accelerate their economies faster than the old mercantilist structures in places like Spain and France. We should mention a bit of social history here at the end. We should note that as the influence of the Catholic Church decreased, things the church had regulated in the Middle Ages, such as public morality, things like prostitution or adultery or marriage, these things fell to the civil authorities, and more the role of law rather than the church. And that also included poor relief. So we see governments as early as the 1500s in England enacting poor laws, trying to restrict migrant labor and what they called vagabonds, homelessness, and trying to come up with some way to force them to work, but also make sure they're not starving. These laws were fairly primitive and treated the poor generally as being dangerous. But as structures were changing, as the church became less influential, it fell to the state, either local government or the crown, to deal with these things. Still, many things were dealt with public shaming. So, for example, an adulterer might find themselves, their house surrounded by the townsmen and women banging pans and making fun of them. You have things like the stocks and so on, where public shaming was part of how villages enforce cultural norms. You also have the accusations of witchcraft increase. We often mistakenly put this as a medieval issue. Actually, very few witches were killed in the Middle Ages. Wasn't really something that they were interested in too many places too often. But you do have this burst of belief in the supernatural, alchemy, astrology, and then you have reactions by certain authorities. And so the witchcraft craze, as it's known, was actually a very short period of time, about 50 to 60 years, and happens in the late Renaissance. We're not going to do a lot of document analysis in this video. I just want to do one, but this one's interesting. It's a speech by Bartolomeo de las Casas, a Franciscan priest who protested against the conquistadors' treatment of the Indians. And he quotes the sermon of an earlier Franciscan, Antonio Montesinos, a sermon given to conquistadors in 1511. Tell me, by what right or justice do you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible slavery? So if we're looking at this document, you can pause this and read it for yourself. But notice that Montesinos, here quoted by Las Casas, is using Christian theology, the idea of the equality of people created by God, to try to shame these rough, brutal conquistadors for their treatment of Indians. It ends with, are they not men? Do they not have rational souls? And so, thinking about the context here, remember, if it helps, if you can remember, Las Casas convinced the crown of Spain to outlaw the enslavement of Indians in Spanish colonies. That's a nice little piece of outside information if you saw this in a DBQ about colonialism. You remember, the Catholic Church accompanies the conquistadors and sometimes is part of the conquering process, but once in a while you see them standing up against the brutality. Okay, and again, apologize for perhaps I did this a little too early. There's a clash, that's actually a clash about how to treat natives. Point of view as a priest, Montesinos or Las Casas, whichever one you're talking about, Las Casas is quoting Montesinos, would take the Christian ideal perhaps more seriously than other Catholics, especially conquistadors who are soldiers and kind of not the most reputable of people. Okay. And also, you might argue that if your goal is to convert the natives, it really doesn't help if your fellow Spaniards are killing and enslaving them. It also illustrates the culture clash in an age of exploitation, and that there were conflicting motives among colonizers. So I hope this was helpful to you. This concludes Unit 1, and we will launch some new lectures on Unit 2, which will cover 1648 to the French Revolution next week. Peace out.